Are you a gamer? Do you wish you could play a game inside a game where you pretend to be a gamer among other gamers? Am I confusing you? Maybe? I'll just get on with the review. CrossCode is a game that will challenge you. It'll piss you off, it'll make you feel like a goddamn idiot. But it's also a hell of a lot of fun. It's got a lot of things to throw at you, fun, flashy combat, many puzzles, and dungeons that might be a little bit longer than they should be, but for anybody that loves an old school RPG with a bit of a modern touch, this is a game right up your alleyway. Don't go into this game thinking it'll be a quick easy breeze because it's anything but. It's a serious grind and it's challenging as well. Though it may look a little more innocent at face level, this game can be a little bit sadistic, especially towards the end. Push through it however, and you'll get your reward. It's a game with nice visuals, intertwined mechanics, and an interesting story to explore. For a very competitive price on Steam, CrossCode is a game well worth having a look at. First and foremost, CrossCode is an action RPG, puzzle game, dungeon crawler, and a few other things as well. It has quite an array of different mechanics, but they all tie in together pretty nicely. At its core, it's an ARPG and has plenty of action, with multiple enemies you'll encounter and multiple boss fights you'll inevitably struggle against. The combat is flashy and in your face, with an emphasis on using different ability arts being quite fast paced. It'll test you with dodging and guarding as well, and is overall quite challenging as well as engaging. I particularly like the combat ranking mechanic that caused enemies to drop more loot when you chain together multiple kills. At first I was a little opposed to it, but it definitely helped make combat more cutthroat rather than just running off and healing again after beating a few enemies. In all honesty, I was a little disappointed to see this mechanic not really used a whole lot throughout the game. It definitely helped to keep the general enemy combat interesting and fast paced. Overall, the combat has a little bit of brains to it, it's not all just mindless button mashing. You'll need to use certain abilities and strategies to beat certain enemies, in particular the boss fights. The boss fights were quite good, some a little bit of an endurance test, but they were flashy and exciting and certainly challenging nonetheless. There really wasn't a lot of room for error in the boss fights, nor much of the combat in general, which made it exciting, but also quite frustrating at times. Now look, I'm not gonna say that CrossCode is the Dark Souls of top-down RPG games, but hell, it's not easy. The game takes quite an abrupt difficulty spike towards the end as well, which caught me completely off guard after going through most of the game relatively smoothly. This game pissed me off. Quite a lot. It's a really interesting mix of having a blast and hating the shit out of it. Left me feeling a little ambivalent towards it during my playthrough. That being said, there's a great sense of relief when you finally do beat that boss or that overly convoluted puzzle that you've been stuck on for the last 20 minutes, and the movement and combat is very smooth and precise, so it feels good to master it. Speaking of which, puzzles. There are quite a few of them in CrossCode, and in particular during the main dungeons you'll complete, and they do a good job of making you feel like a bit of an idiot. There were multiple times where I got stuck on a puzzle and had no idea where to go, only to figure it out a moment later and feel completely brain dead for not noticing it earlier. Which I guess is a testament to good puzzle design. There might have been maybe too many puzzles for my liking. I was a little more in tune with the combat and the story than I was using my brain power, but that was more of a personal preference. That being said, the dungeons were too long. They all take a little bit too long to complete, and there was one dungeon where I thought I'd beaten it, and it turned out I was only halfway through. While I thought they were laid out well and were challenging to both your reflexes and your puzzle solving skills, they were simply too long to prevent them from becoming a drag. I came out of each dungeon simply thinking, thank fuck that's over. Now that we're mentioning it, the game itself is quite long. It is an RPG and therefore does incorporate a few more grindy aspects and such, and RPGs typically take a little longer to complete, but it was still quite a long game nonetheless. I don't think that it became particularly stale by the end of it, but I did find that I was rushing through it towards the end a little bit. One purpose that dungeons served was to introduce you to each of the elements you'll unlock during your playthrough: heat, cold, shock, and wave. Each element will have its uses not only in combat, but being able to solve certain puzzles, being able to freeze things with cold or melt them with heat and so forth. But for combat, each element has its own skill tree, or as they're known in game, circuits, and you will jump between these skill trees when you switch between the elements. This is a really good mechanic. It basically allows you to have multiple different builds and stats that you can hot swap between during combat to suit whatever you're fighting. It's a big part of what the game builds a combat around, which, again, prevents it from just being a mindless button mash. You can have a more melee-oriented build on your heat element and a more ranged-oriented one on your cold, and so forth, which was just a really neat mechanic. Obviously, not all of CrossCode's mechanics are combat-oriented, however, and one other major mechanic in this game is its platforming, per se. The terrain has multiple different layers of elevation in CrossCode, and you will automatically jump when running over the edge of a cliff, which allows for this parkour-like mechanic. While I liked it and thought it definitely added to the challenge, it suffered from one pretty major issue: depth perception. CrossCode is a 2D top-down game. You aren't able to get that extra center depth that you would get from a 3D platformer, yet it still demands another dimension of movement that you wouldn't get in a typical 2D platformer, and struggles a little because of it. It wasn't always clear exactly which platform you had to jump to or which ones were actually a little higher than you could reach because of this. I don't think it totally killed this mechanic, but it certainly didn't work in its favour. I still found the overall level design to be quite good, each area being very well fleshed out and intertwined. The progression of each stage feels quite natural, as the level layout does well to show you how to advance to each area rather than explicitly tell you. Another thing that I disliked about the game is that it can tend to feel a little cluttered at times, particularly towards the start. It throws a bunch of information and quests at you, which is a little hard to keep up with. Some of the key missions also felt lazily thrown in, a bit like filler, which comes back to the length of the game. It felt a little bit artificially lengthened at times, which was not good. That being said, the game does a good job of being an RPG pure and simple. Interacting with NPCs is worthwhile as it helps to explain mechanics and other aspects of the game. The map system is pretty easy to use and has markers you can put down, and the UI and inventory systems are pretty straightforward as well. One of the best things about CrossCode is how it often distracts you from the fact that you're not just playing a generic RPG, you're playing a particular story within one. The world we're in is a little bit of a slightly overdone anime trope, the whole inside an RPG game world thing, but without spoiling too much, it's definitely different enough from that generic weeb shit, and it is actually pretty interesting. Again, I'm not going to be spoiling anything about the story, as that'd be a bit of a dog move on my part, but what I will say is that it's very dialogue heavy. You're going to be sifting through a lot of dialogue, so if you're not into that kind of thing, it might not be the game for you. The game does allow you to skip cutscenes and such, which I think should be practically a given in video games these days. It helps with replayability or the inevitability of dying and having to replay the cutscenes multiple times. In terms of visuals, the game looks pretty damn nice. The level designs are very good, and the sprite and tile work in general is very much up to standard. It's clear they've gone for a retro kind of pixel art look, and they've captured that very well. It's quite like Stardew Valley, but probably a little bit nicer. The level design is a little more fleshed out, as are the character sprites. The character animations and effects are also a fair bit smoother. In all honesty, the little Naruto running animation that Leah did throughout the entire game is probably my favourite thing about CrossCode. The actual character portraits were pretty good. Again, I'd rate them a little more highly than Stardew Valley's, but they weren't the best pixel art sprites I've seen. That being said, they're quite expressive, which is very important for the character of Leah. Here's a very minor spoiler that you'll uncover literally 10 minutes into the game. Leah can't talk. Well, not properly anyway, she is limited to very few words. Despite this, Leah is probably the most expressive character in the whole game. I like that Leah's inability to talk is explored and explained rather than just being a generic mute hero that doesn't talk. I guess given the context of the online game world, it makes more sense this way. The way that Radical Fish have designed Leah's character is really well done in my opinion, and even though her vocabulary is very limited, we're very easily able to sympathize with her and understand her train of thought, often through her expressions and her interactions with other characters. The characters in general I found to be reasonably well written, and I particularly like the fact that many of the characters are online users, which makes them a little more relatable to us epic gamers, but it certainly adds a layer of depth and perspective to the game world that we're playing in. Extra touches like other players running around the environments and town hubs really help the game feel a little more alive and emphasize the fact that it's an online world. And then there was the guy that talked like Scottish people do on Twitter, so I also enjoyed that immensely. The game is a little self-aware, calling out early access games at one point and having plenty of not so subtle references to other media as well. CrossCode's soundtrack is also pretty good, a little bit retro, the kind of thing you expect from an indie pixel art game. I've said it plenty of times, the soundtrack isn't anything to rave about, but it did its job and enhanced the game nicely. The soundtrack that plays when you enter combat got old a little quickly, however, and the game might have benefited from having a different combat track for each area. Even though I felt a little ambivalent about CrossCode while I was playing it, now that I've finished it, I can definitely look back and say that I enjoyed it. Although the game made me quite mad and it felt like a bit of a drag at times, it was a positive experience overall. The low margin for error in the combat sometimes made it frustrating, but very rewarding. The story was interesting and had enough twists to keep me invested in it until the very end. And then there was the character of Leah and how she interacted with this world. Despite being practically mute, she was a character I could easily sympathize with, which does well to keep a player interested in an RPG game. And I mean, look at this. You're gonna tell me this isn't basically as close as you can get to a playable Wooper protagonist in a video game other than the real thing? Again, don't come into CrossCode expecting a breeze. Expect to invest a fair chunk of time and effort into it, but expect to be rewarded for your investment. And sure, the game isn't perfect, but it does do a lot right. If action RPG games are up your alleyway, then CrossCode most certainly is too. Alongside the gameplay is its visuals as well, which I believe are more than up to scratch, and capture the exact retro feel that Radical Fish was going for. If you've been missing a story-rich single-player experience with challenging yet rewarding gameplay and an interesting protagonist to play as, CrossCode is a perfect game for you to get stuck into.